Hey guys, this is part 2 of my little pregnancy type 1 diabetes related videos. My first one was my experience being pregnant with type 1 diabetes, just the things that are slightly different with being diabetic and pregnant, the appointments you'll have, and my personal experience. And this one is going to be all about labor and delivery. So let's get straight into it. I will say again that I am 31 years old. I have been type 1 diabetic for 24 years. I did use a CGM and multiple daily injections throughout my entire pregnancy. And here we are talking about having my baby. So I was induced at 39 weeks to the day, and I was already dilated to a 3. So when I got to the hospital, we did not need to do any cervix ripening or anything like that. We just went straight to Pitocin to help move my labor along. And my doctor did actually come in, I would say about 2 hours after I got to the hospital, and he broke my water to also help move things along, which I was completely fine with. Like, they're not going to do things you don't want. He asked me, is it okay? Would you like me to? And I was just like, yes, let's do this. So he did break my water and told me, all right, I'll see you when you're ready to push, because the doctor's office is just right down the street and I will be back. And so I was left with the nurses at the hospital, who were awesome. So when I was 36 weeks pregnant is when I started to really think about how my diabetes management was going to go while I was in the hospital, because I've heard, at least in the book that I read, that some of them like to be pretty strict and tight on that and don't like to let you have any kind of say. So I asked my doctor, like, how is that going to go? And he said, when you're in active labor, I would prefer that the hospital is more in charge of it, but then after you've delivered your baby, for the rest of your hospital stay, you are back in control. You'll be just doing all your injections, so bring all your own medication. And that was in my own experience. In that book, it talked about how some hospitals don't let you bring in your own medications at all, so always check with your OB in the hospital that you will be delivering at. So right when I got there, they gave me my IV and they started the Pitocin. They gave me a glucose drip and also an insulin drip, and they could kind of adjust how fast that insulin and glucose was coming. When I got to the hospital, my blood sugar was actually like 170, and that was honestly kind of normal for me, because in the mornings I naturally come up, but I didn't want to take too much insulin just because I didn't want to be too low going in. Ended up being a little too high. And so they gave me the insulin and glucose drip and everything, which was a bummer. I didn't want to be 170 when I went in, but that's just the way things worked out. So after they got me all hooked up to everything, and I was just kind of hanging out, waiting for things to start moving along. And after I had my water broke, I very quickly actually started feeling contractions. They weren't super strong, but I will tell you, if you have not been pregnant before and you're like, oh my gosh, what if I don't feel my contractions? What if I miss them? I don't know what they feel like, and you think you're not going to make it to the hospital in time, you'll make it. I had never felt them before, and I started feeling them. I was like, this is definitely not just cramping. This is a full-on contraction. I started feeling it, and I was like, you start to feel a little dumb, like, oh, how could I have missed this? But, you know, your mind likes to tell you different things. But I started feeling my contractions, and I wanted to wait as long as possible to get the epidural, because I don't know, I wasn't planning on going all natural, but I just wanted to wait a little bit longer. But the nurse came in and said, hey, if you want an epidural, we kind of have to do it now, or you're gonna have to wait hours, because they had a scheduled C-section. And so I was like, I am kind of feeling it, and I was like, we better just get it. And I could control, like, if I needed more epidural or not for more pain. So I was just like, okay, I'm not going to take, like, the extra doses. And so I got the epidural, which I actually still felt, like, almost all of my contractions with the epidural. They were not quite as painful, but I was still feeling them. And some of them were quite intense. So sometimes your epidural does not work as great as you hear it works for other people, but that's just how it goes sometimes. So I did get the epidural. It did help. If you're planning on epidural, don't be like scared, oh my gosh, it's not going to work, because even if it doesn't work fully, it did make it a lot more comfortable. So the nurses kept coming in and checking my blood sugar just to make sure it was coming down from that 170, and it did come down to 80, which was like perfect. I was like, awesome. They told me, we're going to turn off your insulin drip. So I was like, okay, are you going to turn off the glucose drip as well? And they said no. And I was like, just thinking there for a second, like, this doesn't make any sense. If you're giving me glucose, I don't have any insulin, I'm just gonna go straight up. And like, I know my body that it is like, when I'm put in like an intense situation, like lifting weights or stuff like that, my blood sugar shoots straight up. And so I was just thinking about that. It's like, when I start pushing, it's gonna go straight up. And so I told them, I said, if you do not turn that glucose drip off, I am going to go straight up. Like, I know my body, that's what's gonna happen. And they kind of didn't want to believe me or go along with that, but I kept talking to them like, please, like, just try and keep checking my blood sugar. And the nurse went out. It's like, hey, let me go talk to them, because the hospital I was at, you have to have 2 nurses to okay anything that happens. So she couldn't just make that decision on her own. So she left and came back and said, all right, you know your body best. We're going to turn off the glucose as well. So advocate for yourself. You know how your body reacts to things as a type 1 diabetic, and don't just be like, oh, they know. Because a lot of these people, not to say that they don't know what they're doing, but I mean, they're not dealing with type 1 diabetes every single day. You know how it can affect every type 1 diabetic differently. Like, my body reacts differently than other type 1 diabetics. So you know your body, advocate for yourself, and do what's best for you. So a lot of my time in the hospital, like while I was waiting for that time to push, was just kind of hanging out. Me and my husband were just talking. He was putting pressure on my legs when I would feel contractions, and we were just riding the waves of labor and delivery. And then my nurse came in. I said, you know, I really don't think this epidural is doing anything for me. I was feeling so much pressure, so much pain. And she was like, oh, she's like, that's strange. Let me check. And she's like, oh, she's like, you're at a 10. Like, let's start pushing. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this happened so fast. I think I was only in labor and delivery for like 7 hours, which is a lot faster than I've heard for other people. I've heard faster, but that time just went by so fast for me. I couldn't believe it had already been like 7 hours. As it was time to start pushing, my nurse was like, hey, we're gonna turn that glucose back on. Not the insulin, just the glucose. And I was like, oh, because I mean, they're thinking that your body's working overtime, and so it's going to drop your blood sugar, which I mean makes sense for like cardio type things. I guess I don't know, because I've never given birth before, and so I just kind of trusted them. But also in the back of my head, I was like, oh, I know when I do any kind of exercise, I always shoot up first and then I'll come down after. And so I was kind of a little iffy about that, but I was just like, okay, you do it. Like, they have dealt with type 1 diabetic pregnancies before, and so I trusted them on that. And so they did it. They turned on the glucose, and it came time to push. And let me tell you, pushing out a baby takes a lot of endurance that I did not know I was going to need. I don't know why. I asked multiple people while I was pregnant, I think I'm going to take a pregnancy test, or not a pregnancy test, a pregnancy class, a birthing class, figure this all out, just feel more comfortable. And they're like, oh, you don't need that. You don't need that. They'll guide you through it while you're at the hospital. So like, okay, maybe I won't spend the money to take a birthing class. Take a birthing class. I wish I would have known so much more when I went in. So if you're kind of iffy on it, just do it. Because I wish I would have known the pushing process. There's like a rhythm to it. And I wish I would have just known like simple things like that, because my flow was getting a little messed up. My nurse told me to pull my legs back but keep my elbows up, like off the bed. And so I would go to push, and naturally I would start to get a little bit tired, and so my elbows would start to drop, and I would lose my endurance to keep going, because now I'm focusing on my elbows being down and not up. And like, thinking back on this now, I was just like, oh, I should have not focused on my elbows. I should have focused on solely pushing. But this was maybe just this nurse's way of doing it, because I've seen videos of people doing home births and they push with their elbows down just fine. But my doctor told me, he's like, you're doing so good pushing. She's coming out, but at the end you lose it and you suck her back in. And now that I'm like done with that, I'm starting to think like, oh, I bet you she was sucking back in after I had to focus on getting my elbows back up. Because imagine pushing and then they're like elbows, and you're lifting your elbows, you're kind of sucking in your core, and you're probably sucking that baby back in. And so it was like messing with my flow. And so let's just say I learned a lot. I'll go over the things I learned at the end of this video. Maybe I've already told you, but I wish that pushing would have gone different, because eventually my doctor said, hey, do you want to try the vacuum? And I was so overwhelmed, my anxiety was getting to me, and I just said, yeah, let's do it. So he attached the vacuum, I pushed, he pulled, and the vacuum popped off her head. And my OB was a little bit worried about that, like, oh, we had a pop off. And I guess that's not supposed to happen. And so he reattached it, we did one more push, he pulled, and my beautiful baby was out. And she was placed on my belly, and it was the most magical moment of my entire life. Enjoy that moment, because if you think, this is how I felt going into the hospital, because I had no idea the process after my baby was here of them checking for all the potential risks that can come along with me being type 1 diabetic, like her low blood sugars and stuff like that. I thought that they were going to take her immediately, because they asked me like, oh, is skin to skin important to you? And I said, well, it's like, if she's okay, then yeah. Like, I thought they were gonna whisk her away and do all these tests, and like, no, you can have that skin to skin. They do not take her away and go check her for all these diabetes complications. You will get to hold your baby on your belly as long as there's nothing like else that's happening at that moment, you know. But she came out and she was perfect. She came out and I got to hold her, and then they did take her eventually just a little bit just to get her weight and do all that necessary stuff. They didn't even check her blood sugar, because they brought her back to me and I was like, oh, do you need to check her blood sugar? Because that was like one of the big things. That's like one of the, I don't know if it's the most common, but I've heard it does happen a lot, where babies have low blood sugars due to the blood sugar of their parent. And so I asked them about that. I'm like, oh yeah, we'll check it. So they don't even check that like immediately. So don't think that you can't enjoy that skin to skin right after you have your baby because you're diabetic, because you 100% can. You enjoy that moment, and knowing that now my next delivery is going to be very different for me. So within like 30 minutes of me having my baby, I was transferred into, I don't know, is it post-birth? Post-maternity? I don't know. Not the delivery unit anymore. And so that is when they tested her blood sugar to make sure it was okay, and she was in fact low. Her blood sugar was reading at 37. The cutoff was 45. And I was kind of stressed about like, okay, why is this happening? And then I immediately went to test my blood sugar to see what it was, and sure enough, it was 186. And I think that's because they turned that glucose drip back on while I was pushing. And I was like frustrated with myself, because I was like, oh my gosh, this is my fault. I should have said something about them turning on that glucose. But it is what it is. At this point is what I was thinking. Let's just do what we need to do to take care of it. And so to fix that, they just took like a glucose gel and put it on their finger and rubbed it on the insides of her cheeks. And then they Came back in, checked it like 30 minutes later. She was still low. It hadn't budged at all. They gave her some more glucose. They came in again 30 minutes later, still low, and our next plan was to try and feed her. And I did have to do formula just because we were in an urgent situation to get something in her belly to help raise her blood sugars. And so we started doing formula. I started trying to feed her, and she would not take the bottle. She wouldn't take it from me. She wouldn't take it from my husband. The nurses came in and tried, and she was just not having it. She would not take a bottle at all. And so after a couple, like an hour and a half of trying to get her blood sugar up, they decided they were going to take her to the NICU. And they told me that, and I was just like, okay, like, we'll do it. And then as soon as the nurses left, I just looked at Keela, and I was so sad because they were taking my baby away. And I also was feeling that guilt of like, oh, this is my fault. But I mean, it wasn't the nurse's fault. This is just how things happen to work out in this situation. And so they did take her to the NICU, and they told me like, hey, you can go up and see her whenever you want to. Like, this isn't, we're taking her and you can't see her. And so we went up there, like, once the nurses were done checking on me, making sure that I could stand again after my epidural to get to the bathroom and whatnot, taught me about my taking care of myself afterwards. I was like, we're going. So we went up to the NICU and talked to my nurse, and she's like, she's doing so great, her blood sugar's up. So her blood sugar was back up and perfect, like within an hour of them taking her. And so I was like thinking, oh, I wish that maybe we just waited a little longer and they wouldn't have had to take her to the NICU. But I'm also glad they were there to help, because maybe it could have been a worse situation. And so I started asking her, I was like, oh, so does she have to, how long does she have to stay up here? Can she come back down with us? And this nurse was not my favorite, but she was kind of like snappy about it. Like, once babies come up here, they're up here for at least 24 hours. They have to be okay for a full 24 hours before they leave. He was kind of snappy about it. And I was like emotional because I just had my baby and she was taken from me. And I'm like talking to Keelan, like, why? She's fine, but I mean, it's also good that she's being checked. I don't know. I was feeling so many different emotions. So she had to stay that night, the first night up in the NICU, but I was up there every single time it was time to feed her, to try and breastfeed her or feed her formula bottle. She did end up being on formula her entire hospital stay, and we ended up switching to breast milk once we got home. But I was up there every time it was time to feed her, and she was doing so well and eating so well and perfect. She never had any other blood sugar dips at all. So that main dip was just due to me having higher blood sugar when she came out of my body, because she's producing her own insulin for the sugar that she has. So when she came out, she's just pumping that insulin because I was at 180, and now she's no longer getting that sugar. And so her body's like, ooh, keeps making insulin because it's not going to just stop immediately. And she has a low blood sugar. And so luckily it ended up being just fine, but I was up there first thing in the morning, 7 a.m. when they do the nurse swap, and my next NICU nurse was amazing. I loved her, and I was just like, oh, she's doing so good, and I'm so happy. And she was like, you know what, we're gonna have the doctors come in and we're gonna try and get her back down to you like within the next couple hours, which was under 24 hours, and I was not expecting it. So I was like, oh, please, like, she's doing so good. I just want her to be with me. And this nurse was awesome. She was just so encouraging, just like, don't give up on trying to breastfeed, and because that's what I wanted. She knew that's what I wanted, and she was like, you're doing so great. Oh, I loved her. I am so happy that I got that nurse after that first one. But so we fed her, and then we came back down to our room while she was still up in the NICU. And sure enough, like an hour and a half later, she came knocking on my door and was like, I have a surprise for you. And my beautiful baby was back down with me in my hospital room, and that was the only complication we had due to diabetes during my labor and delivery. Like I said, I think that is one of the more common situations, and they know how to deal with it. They were like on top of it, checking her, making sure she was good, and so I felt comfortable with everything. I was never like super like, oh my gosh, she's not going to be okay. But I'm glad that she kind of recovered quickly, and I'm so thankful that I have a beautiful, healthy baby girl. We were all able to come home from the hospital at the same time and get to love on her and keep her that second night in the hospital. And even though I had these like couple things happen during my delivery, people think that I'm crazy, but I'm like so excited to have my next baby, because I now don't have this fear of going into my next pregnancy of, oh my gosh, I'm diabetic, my body can't grow a healthy baby, I can't deliver a healthy baby. And I now know that my body is capable. I can do it. I've been diabetic for 24 years, and my body can grow a beautiful, healthy baby. And I'm so happy about that. I'm not gonna cry. I'm just so thankful, because for the longest time, which is another reason that my husband and I pushed off having kids for so long, was that I don't think that my body can do it. Diabetes has ruined my chances of having babies. And I truly believed that. But that is not the case. So if you're also stressed, just thinking that it's impossible for you to have a healthy baby because you are a type 1 diabetic, that's not the case. My baby girl is beautiful and healthy, and she has not had any issues since being born. I have checked her blood sugar a couple times just because I have that bit of anxiety, but it's always been perfect. No issues ever. And my body did that. My broken body produced a perfect body, and I am so thankful that that is how this situation turned out. Now to talk about the things that I have learned and would love to do differently for my next pregnancy and delivery. My time being pregnant, I don't want to do anything differently. My pregnancy went so smoothly. I am so thankful for that, and I just stuck to that low carb diet, and that's what made me kind of almost sail through. I did have those hard times, but I don't have anything to complain about with my pregnancy. My delivery in the hospital, my one thing is I would just like to have a conversation with my nurses to just talk about the glucose while pushing situation. If they could somehow, I don't know, make it less glucose, or if they can completely turn it off, I don't know. But I would definitely like to just have that conversation. Always advocate for yourself, because you know your body, you've dealt with the type 1 diabetes, you know how certain sugars and things affect your body, and just follow how you feel. My second thing would be to not go to that vacuum. I know that it may come to a point where I need it, but I feel like I might have agreed to it a little bit early on because I was feeling so overwhelmed and anxious. And I'm not going to let nurses ruin my flow of pushing because my freaking elbows are touching the bed. Me pushing with all my might and my elbows on the bed is better than me lifting my elbows mid-push and sucking my baby back in. And I'm going to trust my gut feelings and do what I need to do, and not let people tell me that, not that I'm doing it wrong, but I know now that she was getting sucked back in, like my OB said, when I was lifting my elbows. I just know. I know that's what it is. But those are like the main things that I've learned and changed. And to take a birthing class, I think I still might take one with my next pregnancy, just because I'd like to go into my next one that much more confident. But I am so happy that this did, even with hitting those little bumps, it turned out to be a beautiful situation, and I did that, and I'm so proud of myself. And if you're nervous about giving birth to your baby as a type 1 diabetic, like, you can do it. Just because you're diabetic doesn't mean you are not capable of growing a healthy baby and giving birth to that baby. You can do it. I did it. And do not let the diabetes hold you back, because it doesn't. It doesn't. It's a thing we have to deal with as type 1 diabetics, but it does not ruin experiences that we get to have. I hope that this video and the first one, if you didn't watch that, I do recommend watching it. I hope that they helped maybe calm some nerves, just hearing someone else's experience with being pregnant and type 1 diabetic. It doesn't have to be all scary. I was all scared, ended up being awesome. You don't have to be completely freaked out about having a baby as a type 1 diabetic. I hope these videos helped you, and I hope you found them, because when I was looking, I did not find much about being pregnant with type 1 diabetes. But you can do it, have that baby, and it's going to be a good day for you.